this is going to sound incredibly weird, but for as long as I remember from the age of 10, I've just always believed I have a manifest destiny to do this. I always, if you ask my mom when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, I'd pick up magazines and I'd be like, I'm going to be that guy or that woman one day. Like, I'm going to be very, very, very successful.
Hey everyone, I'm your co-host Pat. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Founder Hour podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so you never miss an episode, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the Founder Hour. All right, so for episode 36, Posh and I sat down with Ari Mir, the co-founder of Clutter. Clutter's an on-demand storage and moving company. They come to you, pack your belongings, and then transport them to their local storage facility. In the process, your items are photographed and made into an online catalog, so you can literally request any item back anywhere. They're currently operating in 7 major US cities, including LA, San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. We had an incredible conversation with Ari about fundraising, team building, and his several ventures before starting Clutter. It was really in college when he recognized his entrepreneurial spirit and decided to go after that. Tune in to learn what his journey was like. Also, we have a special offer for you, our listeners. Use the code FOUNDERS75 for a $75 credit towards Clutter storage or moving services. Here we go.
Hey everyone, we're here on the Founder Hour podcast with our guest Ari Mir, who's the co-founder and CEO of Clutter, and he's also started several businesses and sold businesses in the past as well. So we're excited to be here at Clutter, and thank you for having us. We're excited for this conversation.
Of course. No, I appreciate it. Thanks for coming by.
So I saw that you were recently in Chicago. I saw it on your Instagram stories. I did a little bit of stalking. I guess, why were you there?
So we operate in 7 markets. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Seattle, New York, New Jersey, and Chicago.
Nice.
And so I was there making sure that the team felt appreciated. And then I also had a lot of interviews that day, just doing some local team building to help support them.
Were you always in Los Angeles? Did you grow up here?
So I moved to Los Angeles when I was 4 years old. And
From where?
I spent the first 4 years of my life in Paris.
Okay.
And then so I moved when I was 4 years old to Pacific Palisades. Mm-hmm. And I never left LA. I love Los Angeles, and I've been living here ever since, except for a 2-year stint in San Francisco.
Do you remember your time in France as a kid?
It's funny. One of my first memories was eating a Madeleine cookie or biscuit, I don't know what they call it, while watching the Winter Olympics on a black and white TV. And to this day, I still love Madeleines.
Wow. Do you still love the Winter Olympics?
No, I really hate them.
And they say memory starts like after 5 or something, so it must have been a very distinct.
There's 2 memories I have from Paris. One was the Madeleine cookie, and then the other was being in a toy store and my mom saying I can't have one of the toys.
Ari, I know that you also attended USC just like Pat and I.
Yep.
It's
Fight on.
Yeah, Fight on for sure. And last night I actually was watching this video on Facebook. I don't know if you saw it. It was the USC women's track and field team. Did you have a chance to watch it?
No. What happened?
This was an insane match. It was I think it was a 4x400 relay race, and we were like in 4th or 5th place the entire time. And like
Before
literally
the last
5
before the last
seconds,
round, like they fumbled the baton, and like USC's like in like 4th place.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like literally, like I don't know, not even a few yards before the finish line, she just like has this crazy burst of energy and just passes 3 people and wins.
Wow.
Yeah, you should watch it.
We'll send
it
you
doesn't do it justice by talking about
I'll
it.
definitely watch
But the
that.
reason I bring it up is, what is your favorite fight-on moment that you've had in your life, where you were losing the race, like the entire time you were losing, and then you just came back, whether it was the willpower, whether it was I have to fucking win. Like, what was it? What was that memory?
That's a great question. When we were, when my co-founder Brian and I were raising our Series A for Clutter, we made it to a final partner meeting with Sequoia. And as you can imagine, Sequoia being the premier investor in the world, that was an intimidating meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were sitting across from legends like Roloff, Alfred, Doug, Jim, and another half a dozen to a dozen partners. And 80% of the way through the pitch, I just had a realization that it wasn't going well because I wasn't being my authentic self. And I said to myself quietly in my own head, you're not going to walk out of here not having given it 110% of what you have.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just stopped and I changed the tone, and I went from being a reactive participant in the conversation where I was answering questions to leaning in and challenging each and every one of them individually. And so what I did was I picked them out one at a time, and I said, Alfred, this is why I disagree with you. Jim, this is why I disagree with you. Doug, this is why I disagree with you. And it got pretty heated, and then just ended because we had run out of time. And I walked out of the meeting, and I said to Brian, I'm sorry, I just had to do that. I couldn't leave the room not fighting back.
Mm-hmm.
And then I later found out one of the many reasons that they invested in Clutter was that we fought back.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so it was a turning point for the company.
That's awesome.
So we'll definitely get into Clutter, but I know it wasn't your first venture. So kind of going back, I know you studied business in college. Directly after college, what was the vision, I guess, for you, and what did you end up doing?
Well, I went to USC, and I was fortunate enough to get into their undergrad Marshall Scholars Program. And it was a great program because it felt like an MBA, but, during your undergraduate years.
Mm-hmm.
And so you didn't really have to take any arts or science classes. You just focused on accounting, finance, the fundamentals of business. And about halfway through, I realized I know that I want to be an entrepreneur in my life. And so why not just get started now? And so I started to de-emphasize my academics and started to ideate businesses that I wanted to get off the ground. And I decided I wanted to launch a print publication, an actual magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent the last year and a half at USC starting this magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I was successful in starting the magazine, but I was starting to fail my classes.
And this was called Eating Magazine, right?
Yeah. It's called
And were you like into food? Was that what it was, or was it?
I used to do this thing where I would go to the newsstand and I would just ask myself, what's missing?
Huh.
And what I felt was missing was a magazine that combines Zagat, so restaurant reviews, with the content of a Bon Appetit. And so I started a magazine called Eating. And I remember, I spent all year trying to find writers, photographers, graphic designers, printers in China willing to manufacture the magazine. And by the end of the year, my last semester at USC, I woke up and it hit me that I hadn't attended any of my classes. I hadn't taken any tests. I didn't even know what classrooms my classes were in. And so there was no way I was going to graduate. And so, but at the same time, I felt like I really embodied the USC spirit.
Yeah.
Because when you're in high school in Los Angeles, the only thing you ever hear about USC is it's the best school to be an entrepreneur at.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had just gotten a copy of the magazine, hot off the press. And I spent all weekend writing an essay about why I embodied the USC spirit, what I had learned making this magazine, what it meant to me, and that I was sorry that I hadn't, gone to any of my classes. And it wasn't, I didn't do it to disrespect any of the professors or the university for that matter. So I took a copy of the magazine and a copy of the essay, and I slid it under each professor's door. I didn't even have the courage or the confidence to speak to them face to face.
They might have not even recognized you at that point.
They wouldn't have recognized me. I had literally not gone to any classes. Right. And to my surprise, I got a few A's, a few B's, a few C's, maybe one D, but I passed every single class. I was able to graduate that year. And by the way, I graduated early in 3 years versus 4. And it was a huge turning point in my life. But I'm not going to lie. To this day, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, because I had a nightmare that I didn't graduate.
Wow.
Yeah. So
But
to
you,
this day,
but
it's
you
still-
did, right? You
I
have
did.
the diploma.
No, I
Yeah.
graduated.
They sent it to you.
You just opened
But
the
it
door,
was
like,
so
oh, it's right there.
close that to this day, it still haunts me. But I did graduate.
Have
this-
you hung it somewhere so you like know like this happened?
No, it's actually in storage with Clutter.
Well, that's good.
So this itch, you mentioned like this itch or this desire, this realization that you had that you wanted to be an entrepreneur, like in college. Where does that stem from? Like as a kid, I mean, were your parents entrepreneurs or people around you and your family and your friends? Like, where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. So I went to a high school in Sherman Oaks called Buckley, and a lot of successful entrepreneurs came out of that school. And recently, I was at a networking event, and there was a prolific investor there who asked all of us, because we just happened to be in the same room that day, why did Buckley produce so many successful entrepreneurs? And I said to him, well, because Buckley was mostly comprised of immigrants. And there's something to be said about seeing your family pick up and move from one country to another, start over, work 7 days a week, work 14 hours a day, and then make something of themselves so that they can put their family through private school or private university or whatever it may be. Just knowing that it's possible it goes a long way.
Yeah.
And so I definitely grew up in a family environment where 100% of my family members were all entrepreneurs.
Were they in the same space that you're in now, or?
No, they were. They had started companies manufacturing either office furniture or home furnishings.
Did you ever want to get into the quote unquote family business, or you just always wanted to do your own thing?
I always wanted to do my own thing from day one.
So you graduate USC and you have this magazine. Does that turn into anything? Do you continue that after you graduate?
It turned into a lot of debt, specifically credit card debt. I didn't have a penny to my name. I put myself through college with scholarships and some side hustles. And, so I funded the magazine for 4 years using either the advertisements that I sold or credit cards that I had taken out. And so by the end of the 4 years, I had, I think, accumulated $50,000 of credit card debt, which is, very scary when you're, in your early 20s.
Yeah.
And I exceeded my risk tolerance. And even though people love the magazine, we just weren't successful at making it a sustainable business because it was never properly funded. And so I shut it down and I decided to go take a job somewhere.
So you ended up taking a job. What did you end up doing, and how long were you there for?
I worked for a great entrepreneur in LA named Farhad. He was the founder of a company called Shopzilla, a comparison shopping website. You would go to it and you would search for TVs and it would give you all the prices for that TV across the web. And I'll never forget the day I was at home, really depressed because I had shut down the magazine and I was in a lot of debt. My mom and I were living together, and I came across this job listing that was titled product manager. And I never even heard that term. Even though I'd been in tech my whole life, I was a programmer all through middle school and high school and college. I had never heard the term product manager. And when I read the job description, I had never read a job description that resonated with me more. It just felt like it spoke to me. And so I applied for the job, and I went in and I did 5 hours of interviews with the leaders at the company. And I was fortunate enough to get a job there, and I worked there for, I think, maybe 2.5 years. And that was really where I began to understand what it takes to build a successful technology company, because it was all around me 24/7.
I mean, what did you learn? I mean, what was the biggest takeaway that you still apply today?
Yeah, I think if you ask anyone at Clutter what is Ari obsessed with the most, they would probably say people, just like surrounding himself with great people. And my definition of great is very different than I think most people's. And that comes from my days at Shopzilla. The company was successful. The company ended up exiting to Scripps, an East Coast publishing company, for $500 million. But it was never as successful as it could have been. And the reason why I say that is it was one of the most talented teams that I've ever had an opportunity to work with. Everyone in every position was just an absolute all-star. And so sometimes knowing that great people like that exist is priceless.
How do you find those people? I mean, I don't want to say it's hard, but it's definitely a process to find the great people to help build your team and eventually help build your vision. So, how is that process like for you?
It's definitely a process. And at times, there's definitely a team member at Clutter that hates me for that process. It's a massive investment of time. So to give you a sense of how much time it takes, usually when we create a new job role, if you look at a traditional company, they try their best to interview 5 people, and then at the end of it, they'll say, okay, one of these, men or women is good enough. Let's give them the job offer. And so they'll fill that role in no more than 90 days, typically in probably 45 days. When we post a job, we come to terms with the reality that it'll take 6 to 9 months to fill the role. And the reason why it takes 6 to 9 months to fill the role is, if you're starting with 1,000 resumes, for example, to review, the rate at which we let a resume turn into a phone call is probably 20%. So 800 resumes just got put aside. So now you're at 200 resumes. Now, you jump on a 30-minute phone screen. What we do differently versus other companies is we try to put the most senior person available on that 30-minute phone screen, not the most junior. So we put the most senior person available because they have the most experience. And the idea is if they have the most experience, then they have the best pattern recognition for what a talented candidate looks like, or in this case, sounds like, because it's a phone screen. And they'll do a 30-minute phone screen. About only 30, depending on who the interviewer is, anywhere from 15 to 30% of candidates get past the phone screen, right? So that phone screen then turns into a case study. So we ask you to do a take-home homework assignment. Of that, only about a third of candidates get past that stage. And then we ask you to come in for in-person interviews. It's 5 one-hour interviews with a variety of different team members across the company. About half the people that come in get a job offer. If you look at the numbers, that means that, less than 20 bips or, 0.2% of people get a job at Clutter. And so that takes time.
And also just planning ahead of time and vision, just kind of knowing in a year, we need to have this person in this position. We got to get started right now.
It forces you to do that, quite frankly. There are a lot of leaders at Clutter that will come to me and say, we really need XYZ position filled. And we should just hire this person. And I'll say, look, you made a mistake. You didn't plan for this role. And so now you have to feel the pain. And the pain is you're not going to have this role filled for 6 months, because the last thing we're going to do as an organization is put butts in seats. That's the worst thing you can do. And it takes time and coaching to get leaders there. But what's really nice is once they finally do get that individual, you've never seen someone so happy, because they genuinely feel like they have the right person in the right position.
Of course. So kind of going back to when you were a product manager at Shopzilla, you were there for a couple of years, and then you continued in product management for another couple of years at lowermybills.com. And then you eventually started your own business, GumGum. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so after Shopzilla, I went to go work for another great entrepreneur in LA, a guy named Matt Coffin at a company called Lower My Bills. And I was there for maybe a year. And my best friend at the time, Ophir, and I decided that it was time to become entrepreneurs again. He had also been an entrepreneur and taken some time off, and I was ready to, throw my hat back in the ring. And so we started brainstorming ideas, and we came up with the idea for GumGum. And the basic premise of GumGum hasn't really changed too much since inception, which was there's a lot of visual media on the web. How do we, A, understand what that visual media is? And B, how do we drive value from that visual media? And so we started the company, and 10 years later, it's still operating today, employs over 250 people worldwide. They, brought in over 100 million in revenue in 2017, and it's been a great ride.
So that was kind of like your first big business, essentially, that you had.
That was
built,
my
right?
first venture-backed startup that I co-founded.
So what was, I guess, the biggest maybe challenge when kind of going from a job at another company to like starting your own business? And I'm sure this was what, in your late 20s or early?
Yeah, that was in my
late
late
20s.
yeah.
So what was that process like, and what was the biggest challenge for you?
Well, frankly, when you're working for someone else, as an entrepreneur, it feels like a vacation. Because when you're working for someone else, you don't get the stresses, the day-to-day stresses of running a business. Yeah. When you go home, you clock out psychologically. You may still respond to emails, but your stress levels take a step function down. As an entrepreneur, my stress levels never go down. I'll wake up at 4 a.m.
They just compound.
Because it's hot in the room, but as soon as I wake up, my mind starts working. I'm at the gym. I'm in the shower. It's just always, you're always going. And so I always tell people, like, if you're an entrepreneur and you're burnt out, go work for someone else.
And why do you think that is? Obviously, in certain cases, for certain folks, it might be out of fear. For certain folks, it might be out of excitement. For certain folks, it might be, the unknown of like what's going to happen, or just, the desire to continue to iterate. Like, what else could we be doing right now that could take us to the next level? Like, I guess for you specifically, like, is it a combination of all those things, or is it one in particular?
Most people are afraid to fail. I was never afraid to fail. The reason why I was never afraid to fail was I did a thought exercise pretty early on in my life where I imagined a dartboard across the room, and I asked myself, if you put a monkey in front of that dartboard and you give him a few darts, is he going to hit bullseye? And the answer was no. But then I asked myself, if you give him an infinite number of darts, is that monkey eventually going to hit bullseye? And the answer was yes. And so I knew if I just never sat down and I always stood up and I always threw darts at the board, eventually I would hit bullseye once. And that one time, I would know exactly what to do with that opportunity, and I would try to maximize it and drive as much value from it as possible. For me, the reason why entrepreneurship is stressful is the opportunity cost of my time. I have to genuinely believe that I'm creating as much value as I possibly can with whatever startup I'm co-founding than any other opportunity. And Clutter is frankly the first startup I've ever co-founded where deep down I know there's no better use of my time.
What made you feel that way?
So, it's interesting. When I pitched Clutter to Sequoia Capital, that was not the first time I had pitched Sequoia Capital. It was actually the 5th time I had pitched Sequoia Capital.
But not for Clutter.
But not for Clutter. I had pitched them 2 other companies twice over each over the course of 8 years or something. And each time they always gave me the same feedback, which was, this just isn't big enough. And what that means is the market size wasn't big enough to warrant an investment from them.
Yeah.
So it sounded like they liked you. It's just like the idea wasn't there. Like,
yeah, and they even like the idea. They just were like, it's just not big enough.
Yeah.
It doesn't warrant, a venture investment from the top firm in the world. Mm-hmm. And the first few times I heard that, I really hated it because I think deep down I knew what they were saying, which is, this is not a good use of your time.
And was one of these Pocket Change?
One of them was Pocket Change,
which was a virtual currency, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Was this before like the Bitcoin?
Yeah.
So
one of them was Pocket Change.
Could have been big enough.
And one of them was GumGum.
Yeah.
And it's not that they were saying you can't create a business here.
Yeah.
And it's not that they were saying you can't create a business that makes $100 million a year. What they were saying is you can do so much more.
Yeah.
And finally, when we came up with the idea for Clutter, I had 2 requirements. One was I wanted it to be consumer facing because I wanted to create a brand that people loved. And 2, it had to be absolutely massive. And that second question, there was never a doubt in our heads that clutter was going to be very, very big.
Just to challenge, I guess, you a little bit, and maybe it'll get you thinking as well. Why? I mean, two questions. Number one, why did you keep going back to Sequoia? And number two, why this desire to do something massive?
This is going to sound incredibly weird, but for as long as I remember from the age of 10, I've just always believed I have a manifest destiny to do this. I always knew, if you ask my mom when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, I'd pick up magazines and I'd be like, I'm going to be that guy or that woman one day. Like, I'm going to be very, very, very successful. And so it was important to me to make sure I was spending my time on the right opportunities. And why Sequoia? And why did I go back to them so many times? It was important to me to surround myself with the best resources possible. And I don't like losing.
What was your definition of success, I guess, as that 10, 11-year-old kid, and what is your definition of success now?
So it's interesting, as a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, when you're picking up a copy of Forbes magazine, it's just to be in the Forbes top 200 list. Because you don't really understand anything other than a bunch of commas and zeros,
Exactly.
right? Now that I'm older and I realize you can't really spend that money.
You have to have the time to spend the money, so
you don't have
you gotta
time
buy
to spend,
time too.
Yeah, and you don't have the time to spend the money. And frankly, you shouldn't even spend the money because you should be doing, things that create value for society with that money. But now I look at it as how many consumers' lives am I touching / improving. And so there's a long ways to go.
So I think I saw on your LinkedIn profile, it said that you're the idea guy. That's your headline. And you said, you kind of touched on that you came up with the idea for Clutter. Tell us about how that came about.
Yeah, I consider my superpower to be a creative problem solver. And so if you put a challenge or a problem in front of me, I'll come up with an idea or a solution that I think most people haven't thought about. That's what I take pride in. That's what I've spent most of my life working on, developing as a skill. To answer your question specifically, how did the idea for Clutter come about? So we officially started the business in January of 2015. But the idea came about in 2013. And, my co-founder Brian and I were, talking to each other on a weekly basis, wanting to start a business together. And we were struggling to find an idea that met our minimum, requirements. And so I remember one day I said to Brian, the best ideas come from personal pain or personal struggles or challenges, whatever it may be.
Pat tells me that all the time.
Yeah. And so I said, Brian, let's just spend the next week thinking about stuff that annoys us.
Yeah.
And he came back to me the following week and he said, this isn't my problem, but my mom is just constantly complaining about self-storage. And I said, well, what's the problem with it? And he goes, she doesn't know what we have in our self-storage unit. And it's really annoying for her to have to go into the unit and rummage around and pick stuff out. And I said, okay, well, you've identified the problem. Let's think through potential solutions. And at that moment in time, on-demand companies were really starting to boom. Uber was starting to get escape velocity. And for me, the dots just connected. I said, Brian, I think this is actually the one category where it makes sense to apply the on-demand model. Because your mom shouldn't be storing her stuff in her backyard in Marina Del Rey, where land is expensive and it's scarce. We should go into her home, do all the moving and packing for her, and in exchange, she should allow us to store her stuff wherever we want, and we should go store it 2 hours outside the city where land is cheap and it's plentiful.
Yeah.
And that concept was developed right there, that second, and it hasn't changed since. And that's really the key to Clutter, is that we're using technology and people to really leverage a business model innovation.
Something that we always deal with, and we hear this all the time too, is like, when you're young and you come up with your first or second idea, and especially if you went to business school, you know what I'm talking about is like, you have to sit down and like take it step by step, right? Like come up with a business plan, do your market research, do the financials, like what's the opportunity here, blah, blah, blah. But like when you're kind of down the road and you've had so many ideas and you're almost like burned out to the point where it's like, I just want to start, like I know this is going to be successful, like I just want to start it. I guess in this case, how much time did you spend doing your market research, seeing how big the opportunity was? Because public storage is a space that maybe I don't know if you knew a lot about before. So
No, I didn't.
tell us about that.
It's interesting, especially going to Marshall. They really drill into your head the importance of a business plan.
Yeah.
But as a young entrepreneur, the last thing you want to do is write a business plan. I hated the idea of a business plan. For years, I went around telling everyone how stupid it was that Marshall was telling people to write business plans. But I wish I had for every company I ever started, because what I would have found was either there is no customer acquisition strategy that scales, or the margins aren't large enough to create a sustainable business, or the market size isn't big enough. And so when it came to Clutter, I had finally realized the value of a business plan. Now, I didn't do what Marshall wants you to do, which is a 20-page business plan. We just did a 1-page executive summary where it was like, this is our customer acquisition strategy, this is the margin profile, and this is the TAM, or the market size. And then we did a bunch of research on the industry, on consumer behavior, for the next year and a half. I was part-time. Brian was part-time. Brian was going to Anderson at UCLA. He was spending more time than I was during that year and a half on Clutter. But both of us were not fully invested. But then there came a time towards the end of 2014, early 2015, where we said, look, we know everything there is to know about this industry, and we still love this idea. And we also now know how we're going to make this a business, to take it from an idea to a company. And so in January 2015, we started, and then it's been a rocket ship ever since.
And obviously, you had to raise money to start this idea. You had the idea. What was that immediate, besides all the research that went into it, what was the immediate next step in terms of, well, okay, we're going to need money and we're going to need resources and people to actually get this done, because we can't do it just, Ari and Brian.
I called up my friend Adam Ross, who is an investor in tech startups, and I called up my mentor, David Sachs, who's also an investor and founder in companies.
Yammer, right?
Yammer,
yeah.
And was one of the founding team members at PayPal. And I said to the two of them, I don't have any investment materials for you to look at, but trust me, this is a very, very, very big opportunity, and I haven't seen anything like this since Uber in terms of the scale. And they both wrote checks on that statement alone.
Those are some good friends.
Well, I've known them for a long time, luckily. It pays to build a reputation and work on creating those relationships over time. Mm-hmm. And so they invested, and we took that money and we made it into some more. We created some more proof points out of it, and then raised more money. And that's kind of what you do as a founder: is you're just always trying to prove that you should be there, and then when you prove it, people give you more money.
Mm-hmm. So what were those early days like? Was it just you and Brian just kind of, doing everything yourself, or like did you already have a team from the get-go? Like, what were those first, like maybe that year one and year two like?
Well, year one and year two were very different. So year one was, like I said, so both him and I are part-time, but he was investing a lot more of his time than I was. Yeah. I was traveling, trying to decompress from my second startup, Pocket Change, failing, and talking to him maybe on a weekly basis about Clutter. And he was going to grad school, but he was in LA, so he was spending a lot more of his time on Clutter. So that we like to both, say that the first year was just really R&D. The second year, when I was back in LA and he had graduated from Anderson, is really when we threw ourselves into the business. That first year of the business in 2015 was all about marketing and sales. Mm-hmm. We believed that every single penny that we had should go into the marketing funnel. and we should do whatever we can to make sure that the customers that marketing funnel produces, we can serve. And in that first year, we saw a tremendous amount of growth. And then we leveraged that growth to go raise proper financing from Sequoia, which was in October of 2015. And so it was about 9 months of just intense single-mindedness on growth. And then once we got the capital from Sequoia, we focused on team building.
A lot of times the founders that we've interviewed have two different viewpoints. Some love fundraising and others hate it like passionately. They would rather be doing anything else than raising money. What were your feelings about it?
In the entrepreneur community, I'm known as someone that loves it. And the reason why I love it is because without the capital, I wouldn't be able to create any of these companies. Most of these companies require a lot of capital to get off the ground. And I've been doing it for so long that it's a muscle that's fully, that I've fully built. And so for me, it's easy. Now, that doesn't mean everyone says yes to me, but I don't go through the emotional ups and downs anymore.
Yeah.
Most of my peers that are entrepreneurs that are raising venture capital for the first time, if you meet them at any point in that fundraising process, they'll either be the happiest person in the world or the most depressed. And I've learned to just smooth out the emotions.
Someone once told me, and actually this someone was the head fundraiser at USC when they were doing the whole $6-7 billion campaign recently. And he said, because I had asked him, I said, how do you raise so much money? Like it's insane. And he said, let me tell you something. And it was something that obviously someone else had said, but he was quoting that person. He said, when you ask someone for money, you get advice. But when you ask somebody for advice, you get money, Yeah. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. Because he's like, I could go up to someone and say, oh, we need $50 million to build this. And they'll say, oh, great idea, but you could do it in 20. You don't need 50 million. So do you feel like you ever used, that approach in your fundraising, or was it something else that makes you such a strong fundraiser?
I love that advice, but that was not me.
And I feel like it works with angel investing, but for the VC, you're not going to go into a VC meeting and say, hey guys, what do you think?
Yeah. No, it's great advice, but that wasn't me. I was successful raising venture capital because I ran it like a marketing and sales process where it was very structured. I knew what work I needed to do before starting the process. I knew what needed to be done to complete the process. And I did it all using a constrained timeline to create a sense of urgency. And now a lot of people have written about this. Mark Schuster has a great blog called Both Sides of the Table. He writes about this a lot. And now it's common knowledge. But back then, I just viewed it as any other marketing and sales exercise. And I said, look, there's 50 people that can write checks. Let's talk to all of them and let's make sure it's the same message. And let's make sure that I have answers to all their questions and that they're working on my timeline. I'm not working on theirs so that, we can create pressure.
It's been about, a little over 3 years now that you started Clutter. You raised the Series C, I think, last year. 64 million, if I'm remembering correctly. What is the near future looking like for Clutter, and then also beyond that? I know you're going to expand. I saw something that you were saying that you want to expand worldwide. But are those steps already into motion, or is that something that's coming in a few years?
So right now we're in 7 markets, like I mentioned earlier. And our focus as an organization is on team building. What we're seeing is the more successful we are as a company, the more scale that we reach, the more people we need to just even maintain that scale. And so we're very much focused on getting the right people in the right positions and creating the foundation for us to be able to then pursue much more aggressive growth. And, the metaphor I always use is, I always say, if you look at a skyscraper, it takes 12 months of just building out the foundation. No work is done above the surface level. But that, 50 floor or 75 floor skyscraper, once the foundation is set, goes up in less than 6 months.
Yeah.
And so only 30% of the time it takes to build a skyscraper is really spent doing any work that the outside world sees. Most of it is underground. And that's what we're doing right now.
So on that topic of team building, obviously in your case, you spend a lot of time and I'm sure resources to find the right folks to fill those positions. And as I'm sure many other startups and companies do, is like spend a lot of time and resources and money. Once you do bring them through the door and they're employed, how do you keep them around? How do you keep them happy? And how do you keep them doing their best work?
So I'm a firm believer that the two big reasons why most people leave companies are, one, they're not being compensated fairly. And so it's really important you always, as a people organization, have an understanding of what the competitive rates are for an individual. And the second reason why people leave companies is that they come to the realization that they're surrounded by idiots. Whether it's idiots at the peer level or idiots that they manage or at the leadership level. And so one of the things that we work really hard at Clutter is to make sure that we surround people with other people that they're quite frankly impressed by, that they can learn from, that they're challenged by, that they respect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's also important to have a vision or a purpose that people are aligned with. But you can have the most altruistic company in the world. If you don't do the first two things right, talented people are not going to stay.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter what you're doing for the world, talented people will not stay if they don't respect the people that they work with.
Mm-hmm.
Because then they know whatever the mission statement is, they're not going to be able to actually accomplish it because they don't have team members they can work with that they trust. And if you're not compensating them, then they know that they won't be successful at accomplishing that mission because they're dealing with the day-to-day stresses of being financially burdened.
Mm-hmm.
As a founder, as an entrepreneur, you've obviously done several things now over the years. Pat and I all the time will hear, several ideas from our friends and family. Oh, we want to do this, we want to do that, but we don't have the money to do it. But what does it take to just do it?
I found that most people fail to become entrepreneurs because they foresee too many of the problems. They're frankly just a little too thoughtful. If you spend too much time thinking about the problems, you'll scare yourself out of the opportunity. And so I like to say the most successful entrepreneurs are quite frankly blind optimists.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a seasoned entrepreneur, I'm not as blind as I was, but I still try to be because otherwise you'll just never get started.
So you're in this zone now that you're kind of building this company, and obviously there's so much more to go and so much more to grow. What do you do, I guess, when you're not working?
So,
Which is like 1 hour of the day, maybe.
No. One of our values at Clutter is it's a marathon, not a sprint. We work hard, to be clear. I work probably 6 days a week, but we don't work as hard as some other companies in the world because we genuinely do believe it's a marathon. So I like to spend my time either trying to work on my personal health. So I'll go to the gym every day for 45 minutes before the start of the day. I'll spend my time going to museums. I'm an avid fan of art and all things creative. And then obviously the normal food and beverage with your friends and family.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes more beverage than food, depending on how the week went.
Yeah.
What would you say is one of your favorite museums out here in LA?
So this is funny. Even though I love art, I equally like cars. Okay. I think the Peterson Automotive Museum is one of a kind.
Yeah, that's
outside,
the new one
outside and inside.
Yeah. And I'm a critic of the architecture.
Yeah.
I think they could have picked a better red, but once
darker.
Yes,
yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a little too flashy.
Yeah. I would have gone with like a burnt or a burgundy or something like that.
I feel you.
But once you're inside those four walls, those cars are beautiful. I want every one of them.
You mentioned physical health. Another topic that we hear a lot, especially in the founder community, is mental health, and how important that is, because I feel like, kind of going back to your point about like just kind of doing it, and your question, just doing it, and you kind of like head down, you're just kind of focused, and you don't really think too much about anything else, and you keep yourself busy. But there are moments as a founder, many moments where it's not so focused and, I guess,
It's not all
positive.
rainbows and butterflies
Exactly.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
compromise
There are times
and
when you're
whatever
just
that song
down and
was.
things might not be working out, or you're just thinking about the future and just like, I don't know, maybe fearful, worried. How do you maintain your mental health?
So I think there's 3 approaches, right? The first is to go see professional help, which I recommend to anyone that needs it. I haven't chosen to go down that path because I've leveraged 2 different strategies. One is I try to be as transparent with the people I work with and my friends and family about how I feel about the business. And sometimes just saying how you feel about the business helps a lot. And so we'll have an all hands, and the first thing I'll say is, geez, I'm really fucking stressed right now. And this is why. And that helps me immediately. The other thing that I've leveraged in the past is, so there's a great investment firm named First Round Capital.
Yep.
And they put together a support group for their CEOs, where 6 to 8 of us would meet on a monthly basis, and we would talk to each other about our respective problems. It could be personal, it could be professional, it could be whatever you want to talk about. Very similar to another organization named YPO. I liked this one more than YPO because it was all tech founders, and I just found it more valuable. But that was great. Sometimes just hearing that other people are having the same problem or experiencing the same problems you're experiencing goes a long way. I don't have that anymore now that I moved back from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and I've been thinking about joining YPO. But frankly, I'm also at a point in my career now where I've seen enough of this where very little gets to me. And so I don't personally need the support groups as much as I did in the past, but I'll probably still join YPO just for sanity's sake.
How would you say you've dealt with that feeling of instant gratification? Because a lot of times as entrepreneurs and founders, and when you're reading that Forbes magazine as a kid, and I mean I've done the same. I think I have like an Instagram picture of me with a Forbes magazine with caption like I'll be on it soon or something like that.
Nice.
I want to be at that level, sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And obviously day after day you realize like that's not the case.
Right.
How do you mentally deal with that?
Well, I remember I was 18 and a half, and I
18 and a half is
Yeah.
key, yeah.
and I was going to USC, and I woke up one day and I said, holy fuck, I haven't done shit with my life. Like, I thought I was going to be Bill Gates by then.
Freshman
And
year.
I had just lost focus.
I should be dropping out at any time.
Yeah. And I just lost focus. So I went to work, and year after year, it didn't happen. But I made progress. And I started to come to terms with, as long as I make progress, it will happen one day. It's just not going to happen on the timeline I originally imagined. Now, 15 years into it, or 15 years into it, I'm starting to feel like I'm closer than I ever have been. And now I'm more patient than I ever have, than I ever have been, because I know as long as I don't give up, it'll happen one day. But, the reason why I think I'm more mature about this topic now is I realized along the way how much luck is involved. You could be the smartest person in the room. You could be the hardest working person in the room. But if you don't get lucky at all, it's not going to happen.
And Guy Ross, who has the How I Built This podcast, his last question is always, was it luck or was it skill or, whatever. And he'll always stutter when he says it. I love it. And I think one of the people that actually we interviewed said, if you refuse to believe that luck has anything to do with it, you're an asshole. Like, you're just like the most arrogant person, because
I agree.
it just doesn't work out that way. But just to kind of wrap this up, I know you said that you love creative problem solving. So along the way, I was thinking, oh, maybe we can exercise, these powers. One of my biggest issues, and not even my biggest issue, I think as an Angelino, if you've lived here for more than 2 days, you've experienced like traffic.
Yeah.
In the city. First of all, do you believe that there is some sort of solution? And if so, like, when can we see that solution?
So I'm quite passionate about the topic of traffic because
Me too.
before I started Clutter and after I shut down Pocket Change, I was fortunate enough to have a break where I could travel. And so I spent a year traveling the world. I went to 23 countries. And I came back and everyone was like, what did you learn? And I said that every city has a lot of traffic. Like, it's not an LA problem. Like, it's naive to think it's an LA problem. The traffic in London is worse than LA. The traffic in New York right now is worse than LA.
Is it the density? Like, why do you think that is? Like, why do you think LA
So
people...
right now, 55% of the world's population lives in cities. In the next 10 years, I believe, I don't know the time frame, but I think in the next decade or two, that's going to go up to 75%. And that's a problem. Now, LA specifically, I believe the solution is twofold. One, you allow for these micro towns to develop. So, for example, Century City is the first, I think, real instance of that. The Westfield Mall has everything you need.
Yeah.
Ice cream shops, supermarkets, movie theaters, dry cleaning, and they're starting to build skyscrapers around it. That is the beginning of something very big that will transform LA and any other city in the world. Now you connect that with what Elon's working with, which is underground tubes,
And
transportation tubes.
Flamethrowers, or in his words, not a flamethrower.
Yeah, not a flamethrower.
Not
I was gonna correct you.
Yeah,
exactly.
not a flamethrower. Not a flamethrower.
By the way, I just love that whole project. It's so
He's a character.
He doesn't give a fuck. So if you connect these these micro cities with underground transportation, problem solved.
Yeah.
Problem solved.
Yeah.
Well, Ari, it's been a great conversation. The company you've built and continue to build, and shaping really the LA tech culture is amazing. And, we're excited to see hopefully more. Is it teal? Is that the color? How do you teal? Yeah. More teal trucks, around town and around the world. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your story.
No, thanks you guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah.